Ever looked at one of those stunning river tables online and thought, there's no way I could pull that off in my own shop? Well, here's the thing. A pencil river table is one of the most eye-catching projects you can build, and it's a whole lot more forgiving than you might expect. In this video, I'm going to walk you through every single step, from picking out your wood slab all the way through the final finish. We're covering how to cut the river channel, how to build a proper mold, how to mix and pour the epoxy with colored pencils suspended inside, and how to flatten and finish the whole thing so it looks like it belongs in a gallery. Plus, stick around to the end because I've got a bonus tip that'll help you avoid the single most expensive mistake people make with epoxy pours. Let's get into it. A pencil river table is really just a live edge slab with a channel down the middle that gets filled with clear epoxy resin and dozens of colored pencils. The result is absolutely jaw-dropping. You get this beautiful cross-section of pencil ends visible through crystal clear resin flanked by natural wood on both sides. And the best part? You don't need a professional shop to make this happen. With some patience and the right steps, this is totally within reach. So let's start with choosing your materials. The first thing you need is a good slab of wood. For a pencil river table, I like to use a single live edge slab that I rip down the center on a table saw or with a track saw. That way, both halves match perfectly and you get that mirrored, natural edge on the outside. Walnut is my go-to because the dark grain creates incredible contrast against the bright pencil colors, but cherry, maple, and ash all work beautifully too. Look for a slab that's at least 1.5 inches thick and wide enough that when you split it in half and leave a river channel down the middle, you've still got plenty of wood on each side. For a coffee table, I'd recommend starting with a slab around 20 to 24 inches wide and about 48 inches long. That gives you a finished river channel of roughly 4 to 5 inches wide, which is perfect for showing off those pencils. Now for the pencils themselves, you're going to need a lot more than you think. For a coffee table-sized project, I typically buy around 200 to 250 colored pencils. You can find bulk packs of off-brand colored pencils online for about $15 to $20 per 100 pack. Don't waste your money on premium art pencils here. The cheap ones actually work better because they tend to have thicker, more vibrant color cores. You'll also need 2-part epoxy resin. I recommend a deep pour epoxy, sometimes labeled as 2-inch pour or deep cast resin. This is important because standard tabletop epoxy generates too much heat when poured thick and can crack or yellow. For a project this size, plan on about 1.5 to 2 gallons of mixed epoxy. Grab some melamine board for your mold, silicone caulk, mold release or packing tape, and a heat gun or small propane torch for popping bubbles. And of course, you'll want clamps, sandpaper from 80 grit up through 400 grit, and a good quality wipe-on polyurethane or hard wax oil for the finish. Now let's prepare the slab and create the river channel. If you're starting with a single slab, use a chalk line or straight edge to mark a line right down the center. If the slab already has a natural crack or void running through it, even better. You can work with that. I like to use a track saw for this cut because it gives you a perfectly straight edge along the river channel while keeping the outside live edges natural and organic. Set your cutting depth to go all the way through the slab and take your time. There's no rushing this cut. Once you've got your two halves, lay them out on your workbench with the live edges facing outward and the straight cut edges facing each other. This is where you decide how wide your river channel will be. I recommend somewhere between 3 and 5 inches. Too narrow, and you won't see the pencil pattern clearly. Too wide, and the table starts looking more like an epoxy slab with some wood on the sides. Space the two halves apart on your bench and use a tape measure to make sure the gap is consistent from one end to the other. Take your time here. If the channel is wider on one end than the other, it's going to be obvious in the finished piece and there's no fixing it after the pour. Before we move on, this is also the time to do any rough sanding on the wood surfaces. Hit both faces of the slab with 80 grit on a random orbit sander to knock down any mill marks or rough spots. Pay special attention to the cut edges along the river channel. You want those smooth because they'll be visible through the clear epoxy. By the way, if you're picking up some useful tips so far, go ahead and subscribe to Dale Oakfield's workshop so you don't miss future builds. All right, let's keep going. Next up is building the mold. This is honestly the step that makes or breaks the whole project, so don't cut corners here. I build my molds out of 3/4 inch melamine board because epoxy doesn't stick to the melamine surface very well, which makes demolding much easier. Cut a base piece that's about 3 inches longer and 3 inches wider than your finished table dimensions, then cut side walls that are at least 1/4 inch taller than the thickness of your slab. So if your slab is 1.5 inches thick, make your walls at least 1 3/4 inches tall. Screw the walls to the base to form a rectangular box. Now here's the critical part. Run a bead of silicone caulk along every single inside seam and corner. Epoxy will find any gap, and I mean any gap, and leak right through it. I learned this the hard way on my second river table when I woke up to a puddle of resin on my shop floor. Smooth the silicone with a wet finger and let it cure for a full 24 hours before you pour anything. Some folks also line the inside of the mold with packing tape as extra insurance, and honestly, I do both, belt and suspenders. Once the silicone is cured, set your 2 slab halves into the mold with the river channel between them. Use shims or wedges to get the spacing exactly where you want it, and then run a few strips of hot glue along the bottom of each slab piece to tack them down to the melamine base. This keeps them from floating or shifting when you pour the epoxy. Double check that everything is level. Set a small spirit level across the slab in several spots. If the epoxy cures on a table that's not level, you'll end up with one side thicker than the other, and that means more material to remove when you flatten. Now we're at the fun part, mixing and pouring the epoxy with the pencils. First, cut your colored pencils down to the exact thickness of your slab. If your slab is 1.5 inches thick, cut every pencil to 1.5 inches. I use a miter saw with a stop block clamped at the right distance so every piece comes out identical. You'll end up with a big pile of little pencil segments, and it's incredibly satisfying to see all those colors stacked up. Before you mix the epoxy, do a dry fit. Stand the pencil segments upright in the river channel, packed tightly together with the sharpened ends facing up. This lets you see the pattern and figure out if you need more pencils. You want them packed as densely as possible so you get that gorgeous mosaic of color circles when the table is flattened. Arrange the colors however you like. Some people go with a rainbow gradient from one end to the other, others do a completely random mix. I personally like the random approach because it feels more natural and every angle reveals something new. Once you're happy with the layout, carefully remove the pencils and set them aside in order if you've done a specific pattern. Now mix your epoxy according to the manufacturer's instructions. This is not the time to eyeball it. Use graduated mixing cups and measure your resin and hardener precisely. Most deep pour epoxies use a 2-to-1 ratio by volume, but always check your specific brand. Stir slowly and thoroughly for at least 3 to 4 minutes. Scrape the sides and bottom of your mixing container as you go. Undermixed epoxy will leave you with soft, sticky spots that never fully cure, and that'll ruin the whole project. Pour a thin seal coat into the river channel first, about 1/4 inch deep. This seals the wood grain and helps prevent air bubbles from leaching out of the wood during the main pour. Let that seal coat set up for about 4 to 6 hours until it's tacky but not fully cured. Then stand your pencil segments upright in the tacky epoxy, packing them in tight. Now mix your main batch and pour it slowly into the channel, letting the epoxy flow around and between each pencil. Pour from a low height to minimize bubbles. Once you've filled the channel flush with the top of the slab, grab your heat gun or torch and pass it lightly across the surface. You'll see tiny bubbles rise and pop. Keep the flame moving and never hold it in one spot. Come back and do another pass about 30 minutes later, and then again an hour after that. Most deep pour epoxies take between 24 and 72 hours to fully cure depending on temperature. I keep my shop at around 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit for epoxy work. Too cold and it won't cure properly. Too warm and it can exotherm and crack. Once the epoxy is fully cured and rock hard, it's time to demold, flatten, and sand. Unscrew the mold walls and gently pry the slab free. The melamine and silicone should make this pretty painless. If anything sticks, a plastic putty knife works great to ease it loose without scratching the epoxy. Now you need to flatten the top. A router sled is the easiest way to do this in a home shop. Build a simple sled from 2 straight boards that span across the slab and run a router with a 2-inch surfacing bit back and forth, taking off about a 32nd of an inch per pass. This is the moment where the magic happens. As you flatten through the top of those pencil segments, the cross-sections of every single colored core are revealed in perfect little circles embedded in crystal-clear resin. It's one of the most rewarding reveals in all of woodworking. Once the surface is flat, switch to sanding. Start with 80 grit on a random orbit sander and work your way through 120, 180, 220, 320, and finally 400 grit. Take your time with each grit and make sure you've removed all the scratches from the previous one before moving on. On the epoxy sections, you'll notice it starts to get glassy and clear around 320 grit. For the finish, I recommend a wipe-on polyurethane or a hard wax oil. Either one will make the wood grain pop and give the epoxy a wet, glass-like clarity. Apply thin coats with a lint-free cloth, letting each coat dry for about 4 to 6 hours before lightly scuffing with 400 grit and applying the next. 3 to 4 coats will give you a beautiful, durable finish. If you want even more depth and shine on the epoxy sections, you can wet sand up to 1,000 or even 2,000 grit before applying your finish. But honestly, for most people, 400 grit with a good wipe-on poly looks absolutely spectacular. Let's talk about some common problems you might run into and how to solve them. First, bubbles trapped in the cured epoxy. This is the #1 complaint I hear. It's usually caused by pouring too thick too fast or by air escaping from the wood grain. The fix is that seal coat I mentioned earlier. Always pour a thin seal coat first and give it time to capture those wood grain bubbles before your main pour, and use your heat gun or torch diligently during the first couple of hours after pouring. Second, the epoxy is cloudy or milky instead of crystal clear. This almost always comes from moisture. Either the wood wasn't dry enough or there was humidity in your shop. Make sure your slab is kiln dried to around 6 to 8% moisture content and try to pour on a low humidity day. If you're in a damp climate, run a dehumidifier in your shop. Third, the pencils floated or shifted during the pour. This means your seal coat wasn't tacky enough when you placed them, or you poured too aggressively and the current of resin pushed them around. Set them into a tacky seal coat and pour the main batch slowly, starting from one end and letting it creep across. Fourth, soft or sticky spots in the cured epoxy. This is almost always a mixing problem. You either got the ratio wrong or didn't stir thoroughly enough. There's really no good fix for this after the fact. You'd need to dig out the uncured resin and re-pour that section. The lesson here is measure carefully and stir longer than you think you need to. Fifth, the epoxy cracked during curing. This is an exothermic reaction, meaning the resin generated too much heat. It happens when you pour too deep with a standard tabletop epoxy. Always use a deep pour formula for anything thicker than a 1/4 inch and follow the manufacturer's maximum pour depth recommendations. The good news is, if you follow the steps we've covered, you should be able to avoid most of these issues entirely. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, here's something that'll save you real money and real heartache. Before you commit to your full pour, always do a test pour in a small disposable cup using the same epoxy, the same pencils, and the same conditions. Cut a few pencil segments, stand them in a little silicone mold or a paper cup lined with packing tape, mix up a small batch of epoxy, and pour it. Let it cure for the full recommended time. This tells you 3 things. First, whether your epoxy and pencils play nicely together, because some cheaper pencils have coatings that react with certain resins and cause cloudiness. Second, whether your shop temperature is right for a clean cure. And third, exactly what the color and clarity will look like so there are no surprises on the real thing. A test pour costs you maybe $2 in materials and 30 minutes of time. Skipping it could cost you $100 or more in wasted epoxy and a ruined slab. I do a test pour before every single epoxy project, no exceptions, so that's everything you need to know to build your own pencil river table from start to finish. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe to Dale Oakfield's workshop and hit the bell icon so you get notified when new projects go live. And if you've built a river table before or you've got questions about your own build, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.